Iuno came out recently, and honestly, I'm incredibly happy with the character's kit. There's some aspects within her kit that I'm a little bit iffy on and that I'm not a big fan of, but overall I think Iuno is a very well designed character, and I wanted to talk about it. When it comes to how a unit is designed, there are two primary criteria that I go by. Number 1, when it's a gacha game, you should never have to feel bad about pulling a specific character. And then second, I believe every character should have a genuine weakness that the game is capable of exploiting that is not simply related to your team or your gear. It has to be related with the gameplay of the character itself. For example, Jinxi's weakness is that she is a primarily nuke-based character who isn't really capable of dealing with multi-wave scenarios that well. So let's talk about these two aspects and see how Iuno does for them. First of all, should you ever feel bad about pulling Iuno on your account? I personally believe that no, there is never a scenario in which Iuno is a genuinely bad pull for you. Iuno has a ton of different teams, some as a hybrid character and some as a main DPS. I truly do believe that for most accounts, Iuno is going to have some kind of use case. For example, Iuno is primarily built to be a sub-DPS for Augusta. This is the role that she is intended to play, but it's far from her only one. Iuno is actually pretty competitive with Shorekeeper or Spectral Rover when it comes to the Zani and Phoebe composition, which means that if you have Zani and Phoebe, and you're trying to save your Shorekeeper and your Rover for other teams, you're very capable of doing this if you have a Iuno on your account. So this is a pretty good use case for the character. There's also just other heavy attack DPS characters in the game, like GN and obviously Augusta. Because Iuno has such a universal outro skill that is not locked to a specific attribute, it means that Iuno is going to be good with every single future heavy attack DPS in the entire game. Combine this with her incredibly high personal damage and you've got yourself a hybrid character that's really easily able to weasel her way into teams, as long as she provides some sort of utility with her heavy attack buffing. While she does have the blessing of the 1 light buff in her kit, this is really only relevant for Augusta, so we are primarily thinking about her outro skill when it comes to her utility within different teams. There is also the fact that Iuno is very good as a main DPS, in fact being better than a pretty good chunk of our current limited DPS roster. I can say in full confidence that Iuno is in fact a better main DPS than Sheng Liao. I also believe that she is better than characters like Camellia, and based on my current testing, I believe she's pretty relative if not a little bit better than Phoebe in an S0R1 environment. When you take away signature weapons, Phoebe starts performing better, but that's beside the point. So Iuno is not only good as a hybrid character, she's also good as a main DPS. This means that for a lot of accounts, Iuno actually does have pretty good utility, including ones that don't have Augusta. If you're a GN main, Iuno can be good for you. If you're a Zani player, Iuno can also be good for you. And then there's obviously main DPS Iuno, which works with the current other on-banner character, which is obviously Shakona. And she has all of this utility in her kit without being too broken in my opinion. Her personal damage is the highest among all sub-DPS characters, but as a sub-DPS, I believe her high personal damage is not high enough to really overshadow the other characters within the role. Iuno has her specialty, and doesn't really invade the teams where she doesn't belong. Sure, the main DPS team was not exactly an intended one by Kuro Games, but I believe it's a good thing that she can be a viable main DPS. It means that if you don't have any of the characters that Iuno buffs, you can still pull Iuno and be happy with her. And it's not exactly power creep, because Iuno's damage output is still within reason. And that brings me to my second point. Characters, in order to be well balanced and well designed, need to have genuine weaknesses that are exploitable by enemies. And I am glad to say that Iuno also succeeds in this category. She has two primary weaknesses I can think of, one of which is pretty applicable within Tower, and the other one is rather applicable within Whimpering Wastes. So in both modes, there is something that Iuno does need to watch out for. The number one thing that restricts her within Tower of Adversity is the fact that she is pretty easily interrupted while in the air. Sure, while she is moving around a lot and obviously in the air, so not a lot of enemies can hit her, the ones that can hit her, in fact, do interrupt her rather easily, and being interrupted can be a pretty big deal for Iuno's rotation. As a sub-DPS, obviously it slows you down if you get hit, but considering that a lot of Iuno's animations are on the longer side and the damage doesn't come out until the end, getting interrupted can actually lose you a pretty large amount of damage, because the sentience consumption happens pretty early on in the animation, and if you get interrupted before the animation ends, you don't get the damage buff from the sentience, which means that overall, Iuno can actually lose quite a bit of damage if you do end up getting hit, which requires you to play skillfully, by which I mean, you have to actually pay attention to the enemy if you want to make sure you're not losing that much damage. This just becomes even worse if you're playing Iuno as a main DPS, because, well, you're playing more of Iuno. She has a longer rotation time as a main DPS, which means there's all the more time for you to get interrupted, and all the more damage for you to lose. On bosses like Dragon of Dirge and Morning Ikes, this can be a pretty big deal for Iuno, because they are able to chase her into the air, and they have projectile moves that are able to hit you. So Iuno does have a rather large weakness within Tower of Adversity, but crucially, it's not one that you can't overcome. Iuno is able to deal with her issues rather easily, simply by paying attention to the enemy more, which means you're able to dodge better. However, in Whimpering Wastes, where enemies are less threatening, this is not as big of a deal. And for Whimpering Wastes, Iuno does have an entirely different issue to solve, being actually an amalgamation of two things. One of which being that a lot of Iuno's attacks don't actually have an amazing AoE. It's primarily just projectiles that Iuno is firing, meaning that usually she's only hitting a couple enemies at a time. And in an AoE based mode, this is capable of affecting her performance by quite a bit. But there is also another thing, being the fact that Iuno's aerial playstyle can lead to her missing some of her abilities, which can also be a pretty major damage loss. The primary one I can think of is in fact her biggest nuke, being her Resonance Liberation. This can easily deal over 200,000 damage, and because in the main DPS rotation, you are using it right after you're using Arc Beyond, there's a pretty good chance you'll be too high up in the air to actually hit the enemies with it. This means you need to stall and wait for yourself to come down, which is a DPS loss because, well, you have to wait. But overall, it's still nothing you can't overcome simply by adjusting your playstyle. These are weaknesses that Iuno has that the enemies are capable of exploiting, but it's not an unsolvable problem. It's not something you just kinda have to deal with, but instead it's something you are capable of working around. And that's what I feel is important when it comes to giving a character problems. Forcing a character to be stuck with a certain downside can be pretty annoying when you're just trying to have your fun with that character. But by giving you a way to play around the issue, it means that when something goes wrong, it's not the game's fault, it's your fault for not adapting to the situation. And that's what I like about these gameplay-related downsides. But that's just my opinion on Iuno. What do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Additionally, if you have any questions, be sure to check out the link in the description, which will lead you to my Discord. I'm pretty active in there, so there's a pretty good chance I'll respond to your question. If you just want to see more of me, you can check out my second channel, which is also linked in the description. I primarily talk about PGR, but I kinda just make videos about whatever. But that'll be all from me. Peace.